tonight, Don. We'll get right to our guest, the great Marty Appel, former PR man for the New York Yankees, and really has become the team historian. And as we talked about last week, Don, a great new book out about Casey Stengel, called Casey Stengel, baseball's greatest character. And great to welcome back Marty to the show tonight. Marty, good to talk with you. How you been?
I've been great. Thanks for having me. Always enjoy talking with you.
Mike, that had to be a lot of fun that had to be a lot of fun to put together, because not only was it a long career, but a very unusual career and quite a character.
Well, I knew a lot about him going in. I learned a lot more doing it. One of the things I learned in the course of doing it is that most people under 40 have never even heard of him.
Right.
And so it's like, wow, how many pennants do you have to win, to really be remembered forever? And he did win 10 pennants and 7 World Series, including 5 in a row, in the span of just 12 years. So it was time for a book, because a whole generation or two really needs to be reminded or taught who he was.
One thing that, and I got to give Phil Mustick credit, didn't I realize when I looked at the cover, whose idea was it to camouflage the cap so that you could use it, because he's so well known for both clubs, the Yankees and the Mets, for 2 different reasons, but whose idea was it to camouflage the logo?
Actually, it was my idea. It was a Mets cap, and it was a great photo. It's a beautiful cover design, and it's a great photo. But I said, I don't want people to get the feeling that this is a Mets book somehow, because he's the only guy who ever wore the uniform of all 4 New York teams, Dodgers, Giants, Yankees, and Mets. And he managed Brooklyn, and he managed Boston. He managed Oakland and Toledo in the minor leagues for long periods of time, lived in Southern California, born in Kansas City. He was a man for all geographic regions. So we didn't really want it to be thought of as a Mets book or even a Yankees book.
Right. Doug?
Enjoyed reading the book, Marty, and the great stories you had in there. And my first recollection of Casey Stengel, obviously I didn't get to see him manage the Yankees or the Mets, but I remember he used to kind of hang around Shea Stadium and occasionally be on some of the Mets broadcasts. But a great character, like you said. But I didn't realize that he had managed some of the minor league teams that he did over the years. It took him a long time just to get that shot with the Yankees. He was close to 50, wasn't he?
He was 59 when the Yankees hired him, and what boosted him to the Yankees was he won the Little World Series with the Oakland Oaks in 1948. You have to realize there were 16 major league teams then. There were 30 now. So you'd say, like back then, the next 14 high minor league teams were as good as major league teams today. So that Oakland team that he led to the Pacific Coast League Championship propelled him to one more major league job.
I think he almost had to be a biggest surprise to Yankee fans in New York in general was when Joe Torre came in and George Steinbrenner decided to hire him as a manager. He didn't come in with flying colors. I don't know that Casey came in with flying colors either.
The parallel is very strong. Casey came in with a long record of failure in the National League. He'd never won anything. And they called him a clown. And he did have a reputation, and well-earned, of just being a prankster and, a good fellow who was not beyond doing stunts, like having a sparrow fly out of his cap. When Joe Torre came in, same thing. National League manager, seldom succeeded at anything, was a second division finisher, and they called him Clueless Joe. Now, that was a little different than being called a clown, because the headline meant Joe doesn't know what he's getting into. Still, they came to the Yankees, and in 5 years, their ticket to Cooperstown got punched. Casey winning 5 straight World Series, and Joe Torre 4 in 5 years.
Doug?
He wasn't a bad player either. I mean, you talk about in the book, the stats were not that bad, right? Pretty good power hitter for his team.
He was okay. He had some good years, some bad years, 284 over 14 years.
Not bad.
If they had all-star games back then, he would have been picked once or twice.
It's interesting you talked about everybody under 40 probably doesn't know much about Casey Stengel. That's a little bit unfortunate. I'm a great George Will fan. I don't know whether you read George on a regular basis or not, but opening day he always has a terrific column on baseball, and yesterday he did another. So if you want to look at 20 or 20-something things that happened in baseball that George has followed that nobody remembers. They're right there.
Well, he's a big baseball fan. He wrote a big best-selling baseball book about 20 years ago, and he would have been an admirer of Casey Stengel, and even Casey's use of Stengelese to get around answering a question.
Doug?
I was going to ask you about that, Marty, and you talk about it in the book. You love talking to the media. He called them his writers. I think he enjoyed that part of the job. Was that kind of character that he developed of the Stengelese and talking all around it? But in the dugout, he was a different type of guy, wasn't he? Or am I wrong about that?
Yeah, the players say in clubhouse meetings in the dugout, they knew what he was saying. He wasn't talking Stengelese to them. He would use it with the writers when he didn't want to answer a question, or he couldn't think of the answer, or he was delaying the answer. He became famous for it. People said he always talked like that, but in New York they called it Stengelese, and it became part of who he was. But conversely, he used to always say, learn the name of the writers before you learn the name of the players. They're the ones who will save your job.
Well, I got the book first. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. That's coming up next. But Howard Cosell was the one that put him to sleep in the dugout. He was really one of the, didn't like Casey Stengel very much.
He stood alone in that sense. And so you look back now and you go, Cosell either didn't get it or it was the only one to get it. One of those two.
Cosell was one of the first guys to really just do taped interviews. He carried that big tape recorder around. I guess he thought Casey wasn't telling him what he wanted to hear in his interviews. Maybe that's right.
Well, Casey ignored him when he first showed up in St. Petersburg for spring training. And Bob Fischel, the Yankees PR man, who was ultimately my boss, had to go to Casey and plead with him to talk to Cosell, which Casey acquiesced and did. And maybe Cosell never forgot that, because what we're getting at with this whole story is when Casey went to manage the hapless Mets in the 60s, Cosell did pregame and postgame radio shows and would rip them every day. When are the Mets going to wake up and get a real manager?
He was ruthless, boy. I'll tell you. I heard a lot of those shows. And he's asleep in the dugout. He's this, he's that, he's the other thing. And I mean, for a guy that had the kind of record he had managing baseball team, I realized he was at the end of his career. But again, I apologize. I haven't had a chance to read the book yet. But how much do you talk about with Casey? Because he was really the inventor of the platoon player. I mean, we had Blanchard and Howard, and catching one area of his strength of replacing people time and time again. How about with the Mets? Do you touch that at all?
Well, yeah, but he didn't really invent it so much as had the luxury of using it successfully because he had so much talent on the Yankees. You think of the infielders he had sitting on the bench there, besides Rizzuto and Billy Martin. There was Jerry Coleman, there was Gil McDougall, there was Andy Carey. He could just move these guys in and out, and they were all all-stars. What a luxury. But Casey himself was platooned when he played for John McGraw.
Right.
It wasn't like a new invention to realize that righties against lefties was an advantage and a disadvantage if it was righty-righty. They always knew that, but to be able to actually practice it took a very deep bench.
And Alvin Dork did a lot of that as well, and Gene Mock did quite a bit of it too with the Philadelphia Phillies. So I didn't mean that he invented it. I just mean that he really utilized it to the best of its ability.
He sure did, and he became famous for it. I guess if you said to somebody, what was Casey famous for as a manager, that would be the answer.
Marty Appel joins us. Casey Stengel, Baseball's Greatest Character, is the name of the book. And you mentioned Phil Rizzuto. Also, you talk about Joe DiMaggio, and Joe didn't really see eye to eye with Casey a lot, and Phil didn't either. But I guess one story you had was Casey put Joe at first base, and Joe had never played first base. He wasn't happy about that.
Well, he didn't like to be put in a situation where he might be embarrassed. Casey didn't even discuss it with Joe. He just wrote him in the lineup one day at first base. He'd never taken any ground balls there. He didn't do anything in spring training there, and all of a sudden he's playing first base in Fenway Park. So the game proceeded uneventfully. Joe was not embarrassed, but boy, he was hot under the collar about Casey putting him in a potentially embarrassing situation. The two of them never criticized each other publicly, but there was a tension there throughout the 3 years DiMaggio played for Casey. And it really went back to the very first day of the very first spring training that Casey was in the Yankees camp, when he read a set of spring training rules, and one of them was the players were forbidden to go to the dog track at night. Well, everybody who knew DiMaggio knew that's where he went every night. So this was the line in the sand on the first day. And what do you suppose happened? DiMaggio went anyway, and when Casey was asked about it, he said, well, I wasn't there myself. I have no first-hand knowledge of this, so I have no comment. And the crisis went away. But Joe's kind of won that because Joe defied him, and it didn't become an issue. Today, you'd have 2,500 cell phone photos of Joe at the track.
Unfortunately, you're exactly correct there. But, the one thing about Joe, he was such a proud guy. I mean, it was amazing. Everything he did was really mapped out. He did not, as you said, the biggest thing was he did not want to be embarrassed anywhere.
Right. People say you never saw him dive for a fly ball.
Right.
Because he didn't want to look foolish if he didn't get it.
And that's why they make such a big thing out of the Gianfrido catch, is the fact that it's really the first time he showed any type of monstrous reaction on the field. And that really wasn't much. He just kicked the dirt when he got close to second base. He didn't do very much, but they made a big story out of it.
You're right about that. Exactly right.
Doug?
I've been to that dog track, Marty. It's Derby Lane in St. Pete.
That's right.
Famous dog track. I don't know if it's still quite as good as it used to be, but it used to have a band and everything there. It was one of the best places to go. But,
well, I'll tell you, when the Phillies said Dave Cash was one of the big supporters of the dog track, and of course the owner of the Philadelphia Phillies himself, Bill Giles. I used to go over there were 3 or 4 of us that went over almost every night during spring training in St. Petersburg, and man, they loved the dog track. Dave Cash was a tout. Well, he was all right with the dogs.
Well, you think about it. I mean, I said there would have been 2,500 cell phone photos, and the newspapers the next morning would have all said, "What now, Casey?" or "Your move, Casey." It would have blown up into a major controversy the way things work today. And there would have been Joe and Casey butting heads on day 1 of spring training camp.
Right.
Talk a little bit about, you mentioned it before, the Casey Stengelese, the way he talked, but I guess one of the most famous ones is when he had to testify before Congress. That was almost a comedy act in a sense when they were asking him questions about, I think it was the Kefauver hearings, Marty?
It was the Kefauver hearings in 1958. They were investigating whether baseball should remain exempt from antitrust legislation. Won't bore your audience with going into all of that, but we will say that Casey was asked one question, and he proceeded for some 20 minutes without a punctuation mark, giving his life story, and he had everybody laughing. And then Mickey Mantle followed him, and Mickey said, "I agree with everything Casey just said."
I'll tell you, it'd be interesting to see what Casey had to say about replay.
Well, this was why I've been asked in doing these interviews if there's any manager today that reminds me of Casey Stengel. And the answer is no, because first of all, Casey's great instincts are all covered now by all these loose leaves full of computer printouts. And the second thing is the use of the replays to resolve close calls takes away the manager running onto the field and arguing with the umpire. And Casey used that to his advantage to rile up his team, get the fans excited and behind him. It was an important tool for Casey. Now, you never see managers after they finish handing out the lineups or make a pitching change. But going out and arguing with the umpires is a big change in the game that the replays have brought about.
You're exactly right, because Babe Pinelli and Leo Durocher had that was really, and you talk about Earl Weaver, oh my gosh, that was part of the fun of the game when you saw the Orioles and Earl Weaver come out and go through his dance step.
Absolutely.
How about his personal life, Marty? You talk in the book, he was married for 50, 60 years, and I didn't realize, you may say he was a wealthy man, but he did pretty well with the oil business, didn't he?
He was a wealthy man. Those wells he invested in 1937 in Texas are still pumping to this day,
okay.
and producing checks for the heirs, for the family. People thought he was rich from banking, which his in-laws owned a bank in Glendale, California. But it was the oil well investment that made him independently wealthy, and he didn't really even need the baseball jobs after that. So that was a great thing for Casey. He was married to Edna Stengel. They had no children, so she was traveled with him all the time, made all the road trips. They lived together when he was manager of the Yankees and the Mets on Central Park South at the Essex House Hotel. And Edna wrote a memoir herself in 1958 of their years together, which was given to me by the family to include in the book. So that was a great find because it showed a whole other side of Casey besides Casey the baseball figure. It was Casey, the married man, with the courtship and the marriage and their lives together, and a sad ending when she had Alzheimer's. I mean, this wasn't in her memoir, but she had Alzheimer's disease. She was in an assisted living facility. His license had been taken away because he was now in his 80s, and he would walk 2 miles a day back and forth to go visit her in the assisted living facility, even though she no longer knew who he was. So that was a very sad thing near the end of Casey's life.
Marty Appel, our special guest here this evening, and chatting about baseball and his book about Casey Stengel, one of the great characters and great managers in all-time baseball. What was the biggest thing that surprised you, Marty?
I think the 10 years of his retirement, I really didn't know that much about them. I was in touch with the fella who was his personal assistant in those 10 years. So we talked about what it was like to be Casey Stengel in retirement. And it was great, actually. He had his routines. He didn't mind. He had a listed phone number. People would come to his door, and he loved it. He had a broad net when it came to the baseball industry. He considered not just players and front office and writers as part of the deal, but the fans, the autograph guys at the airports waiting to get celebrity autographs. To him, it was all part of the family, and he loved engaging in chat with all of them. He, when he stayed at the hotel on Central Park South, he was too wound up after games to just go upstairs, so he'd walk around the whole block in New York City, always recognized and always stopping to talk to the fans and replay the game that had just transpired because it helped him unwind.
Doug?
Marty, you've written now as a Yankee historian, the Pinstripe Empire. We talked about that. Of course, the Thurman Munson book a few years ago, and now Casey Stengel. I guess it's kind of almost an endless supply of material for you. I won't say, if you don't want to tell us what you're working on next, but boy, there's just so much to write about, and you've been there for such a long time to be part of it.
Well, thank you. The Yankees just have produced some great characters over the years in addition to great teams. So it's a wealth to work with, and in the case of Casey Stengel, the stories you just put them on paper and get out of the way. There are just so many great stories.
Well, interesting because, Yogi Berra sort of followed that same principle. He lived over in New Jersey, and, he loved it when the kids in the neighborhood came to the door. I'm talking now primarily right up until the very end, not too long ago, sadly to say, Yogi passed away. But he loved it when the kids in the neighborhood came over, and he had a chance. He gave them all baseballs. He signed any autograph they wanted. He brought them in the house. He talked to them. I mean, he was a wonderful, wonderful character, and sounds like Casey outside the game was the same way.
Same way, and one of the reasons they got along so well. And to Casey's credit, he elevated the stature of Yogi in front of the writers. Yogi had been there a couple of years when Casey arrived on the scene, and Yogi was treated in a comic fashion, as though he was almost a comic book character,
right,
with limited education and funny looks. And Casey began referring to him as Mr. Berra, and he'd always point out the accomplishments on the field that the writers might not have noticed. And suddenly there was a new respect afforded Yogi Berra, and it stayed with him for the rest of his life. And he would always credit Casey with doing that. That was a great thing Casey did.
Doug?
Well, Marty, pleasure talking to you again. And before we let you go, get a word or two, if you want, on the current Yankees. I know they got off to a rough start Sunday. Tanaka didn't quite have it, but what do you think about the team this year?
Well, so many young players that it's got to be like 1996 again, when Jeter, Rivera, Pettit all hit at once and were all successful right from the start. It's a lot to ask. So for myself, I'm going to be more patient than expecting everybody to come through in year one. But if we see maturity and development and potential with the rookies that they have in the team, just give us a good year of entertaining baseball, and maybe next year we'll get ready to go for it all.
I really have to agree that 100% more. In fact, I'm watching the game as we do this interview right now. It's the top of the second inning and no score. But I'm always a little disappointed that, all during spring training, they're writing about the Yankees. Bird had a very nice 30 days in the major leagues, and then he had the shoulder problem. He did play it all last year. And then you have the young kids. I mean, boy, I think they, giving them a little too much credit for what they're going to do. I want to see them do it first.
Yeah, I agree with you. And, New York's fans, the expectations are always high. And I think they may be getting a little ahead of themselves on this year's roster.
I couldn't agree with you more. I just think they've overblown all spring training. I mean, one game after another. I mean, I know they had nice spring training. I saw a lot of their games, but holy smokes, we're talking spring training. That's September and spring training don't mean very much to me.
That's true. Very true.
Marty?
Name of the book.
Doug,
I would say name of the book is Casey Stengel, baseball's greatest character. We've been talking to our friend Marty Appel tonight. Marty, appreciate you taking the time. We always keep you longer than we say, but you got so many great stories. We could do 3 hours, but we'll hold off till the next time you're with us.
Well, I always enjoy talking to you and appreciate the time. Thank you.
Take care, Marty. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye now.